Thank you again for the invite today, and I really appreciate it. And I followed the work of Xerces for many years. I'm also a beekeeper myself, and work very closely with farmers on, trying to build soil health, and think about all the facets around how agriculture can benefit the environment around them. And I think, over the last 5-10 years of my job here at UVM, it's been exciting to see so much interest from the farming community around conservation and really expanding beyond sort of general conservation that farmers used to think about, like keeping soil from eroding, to a much bigger view of what conservation is on a farm, from soil health to biodiversity to protecting pollinators. So it's a really exciting time to work in agriculture. It's also a time where we need this work and we need the broader collaboration and interest and excitement from the farming community to be able to put these practices into place. So again, thank you for your time today. I recognize some of the people that are participating, and maybe you've heard a little bit about this from me before, so I apologize for that. But what I'm going to be talking about today is thinking about growing crops in a little bit different way. We generally are focused on crop production to maximize output off from those fields. And when we think about output, we're really thinking about yields generally. And depending on what you're growing, also the quality of that crop, if it's a food crop or a forage crop, not just how much we get from that acre, but what's the quality of it as well. But the focus, again, primarily being on how do we maximize that output of the crop and the returns from that crop. And those obviously are really critical to a farming system and a viability of the farming system and food production too. So not to say that we don't want the focus to be on maximizing output, but what's really changing is how we think about output. And what else do we want out of our land and our environment, our ag environment around us, and how do we modify the way we grow our cash crops so that we can maximize the other returns that we're looking for? And that's a really different way oftentimes to think about things. And what's really exciting is I'm not the only one thinking about this. The farmers that I'm working with here in Vermont are also really interested in how do we change the way that we currently grow our crops, as an example, so that we can maximize the return that we see from our cover crops, not just the return that we get from our crop. And again, that means a lot. It's a whole new way of thinking about things. And as an extension specialist and a researcher, it's really exciting because it's also made me look at growing corn in a very different way. So really, I'm going to talk about my work, but as we go through this, I just want you to be keeping in mind the crop that you might work with, or how the crops you might grow in your garden, or whatever your particular situation is. How can we make some modification to those practices to get different returns? And I know a lot of that's already been talked about today, but again, will be a more specific example. All right, so let's dive into it here. So our farmers in Vermont, and of course we're up in, well, what used to be a pretty cold climate, but the last few days, you wouldn't think that, but still generally a cooler environment, shorter growing season than many places in the United States, which, has its challenges, also its opportunities, but it has been relatively difficult to get cover crops on the radar screen. When we barely have enough growing season to grow that cash crop, thinking about growing something else after that has been a real challenge, because that's a real barrier. You know, it's having enough season to be able to get a cover crop growing. So there's been a lot of interest in interseeding cover crops and interseeding cover crops to establish the cover crop before the growing season's over and get it growing, but also to be able to add some of that diversity. However, this itself has been really difficult for our farms to achieve. It seems easy enough to go out and put some seed into a growing crop and watch it grow, but there's been a lot of variability. And most every farmer that I've worked with, not just in Vermont, but talked with across the country, has mentioned that they like interseeding, but they don't always like the results, that they're highly variable. And here's a picture really from the same field. You can see how variable it is from what establishes, how much establishes. And so what we're trying to do is figure out how to remove some of that variability. How do we get better cover crops from interseeding? As I already mentioned, there's lots of opportunities for interseeding and why people want to do it, especially up in our region, but even across the country. It allows earlier planting. So in our case, if we can get that cover crop established early, it has more time to grow. Farmers aren't worried as much about it in the fall where the weather might become, not as advantageous for planting, or we get an early frost and the cover crop just doesn't have enough time to grow. But I think the other reason that people have been really interested in it is because it allows them to incorporate some of that diversity that we want to see in cover cropping. Cover crops have a lot to offer, and the more species diversity generally that you can blend into that mix, the more benefits that you might get. Or if you're looking for a specific benefit, let's just say nitrogen fixation, you'd be able to grow that type of cover crop, where otherwise in a place like Vermont, by the time fall comes, really the only cover crop that can be seeded at that time is winter rye. So people are excited about interseeding to increase that diversity and really maximize some of the benefits we can see from cover crops. And then again, time and flexibility, just being able to get that seeding done early, maybe at a time where there's a lull in crop work and field work. So again, lots of reasons to want to interseed those cover crops. But as I've already mentioned, there are a lot of challenges to doing that too. It seemed easy, seemed logical when we first started working on it, but it's especially challenging, not just because of our climate, but because of the type of corn that we grow here in Vermont. So the corn that we grow in Vermont is mostly for livestock forage. So it's grown and harvested as silage. And that means that it's planted very dense. So when corn is planted for grain, people are usually planting between maybe 22,000 and 28,000 seeds per acre. But when you're growing for corn silage, you're putting 32,000 up to sometimes 40,000 seeds per acre. So you can just imagine that crop is much more densely populated because we're harvesting the whole plant. We want a lot of leafy material, and we also want ears of corn. So we bump those populations up, making it a very dense, kind of humid, dark environment in a silage crop. We're also growing corn mostly in 30-inch rows, like a lot of farms, but we also have farms that grow in 20-inch rows, again, trying to maximize that biomass per acre. So the crop is grown in narrow rows. And the other issue, and Stephanie was mentioning kind of trying to reduce herbicide and pesticide applications, is that much of the corn that's grown for silage is sprayed with herbicides. And the herbicide application generally occurs just following corn planting or shortly after that. And when you're interseeding, you're actually interseeding about a month after planting. And so herbicide selection is really important, because if you select an herbicide that stays in the soil for a long time, it will hurt the cover crop. So there's a lot of things to balance here. And then we have seed depth and moisture, a lot of challenges to get that cover crop to establish. Here's just some pictures of diversity and trying to maximize that diversity with interseeding. So again, as I mentioned, to grow some of these diverse cover crops where we are, they really need to be planted in August. So, I mean, just as an example, some radishes, annual ryegrass, maybe oats, they need to be planted really at the end of August, no later than the end of September, to be able to produce enough biomass to get much out of it. So in Vermont, corn silage is not harvested until the end of September. So really these type of species, and clovers included, all the legumes, just aren't going to grow and establish very well after Labor Day. So the only cover crop we have at that point, again, is winter rye, which is a great cover crop. But again, if we want to maximize that diversity and function, we really need to have these cover crops planted early. So again, why we're trying to really hone in on interseeding. When I first started working on interseeding, I kind of felt like the biggest challenge was getting the seed out there. How are we going to get the seed out there? The corn is growing and we can't run over the corn. We can't just go all over the field. And so when I first started working on interseeding with organic farmers, actually, that was my first foray with interseeding. We were using these broadcast spreaders and we would get okay establishment. It was generally not too bad. We weren't dealing with herbicides, first of all, herbicide residuals. And we also were cultivating. So it was actually kind of fluffing the soil up a little bit and allowing for the seed to get good seed to soil contact. And you can see that, you know, we would generally get an okay stand. Here's the cover crop. You can see how dark it is growing down in the corn. And there's all kinds of spreaders that we used for our research. But again, especially when there wasn't cultivation and we moved out of organic systems, the establishment became much more variable. We, you know, got into flying on seed, interseeding with these big high boy seeders, really trying to create all kinds of opportunities and timeframes to get the seed out there. That felt like the biggest barrier. But again, all of these, regardless of how we did it, even with these kind of drill interseeders, we still would get very variable results. This doesn't look very variable. This is probably the best interseeding picture I have ever. So again, what we're trying to do now is overcome the challenges, and really many of the challenges have to do with the way we grow that corn crop. And so how do you work with farmers to change the way that they know that they're going to maximize yield and quality the way we've been telling them to? We, meaning, you know, folks at the university, we've developed these corn growing recommendations to maximize that output. And now we're saying, maybe we should try something different so that we can maximize corn output and also be able to establish and get a really good cover crop. So completely different way of thinking. So as I already mentioned, these are the things that we're dealing with. You know, can we reduce the corn populations? Can we widen the corn rows? Can we change the herbicide programs? Can we get better seed to soil contact and moisture, while at the same time really still needing to get the corn chopped timely so that cover crop still has some time to grow in the fall too? All right. So we've done a lot of trials to, again, with the cover crop to try to figure out, you know, how are we going to make this work? We've tried interseeding at different times, interseeding early. So V2 is when the corn plant has 2 leaves. true leaves, and V4 is when it has 4 true leaves, and V6 is when the corn plant has 6 true leaves. This is generally when people interseed, and this is about when the corn is about knee high. And you can see light infiltration are all these lines, and these are different types of corn. But you can see if we interseed at V2 or even V4, there's more time with more sunlight for the cover crop to establish before the canopy closes. So you can tell when the canopy closes because the amount of light, keeps going down and down and down. So at V6, you can see that we've already gone from 100% light penetration down to about 50, and making it more difficult for that cover crop to establish. So we can change the timing of interseeding to help with establishment, but that's not enough. So we've started to look at the corn practices themselves, and can we actually reduce the corn population to be able to get a better cover crop without sacrificing too much yield? And like I said, over time, university research has shown that we should have corn populations around 34,000 plants per acre to maximize silage yield. And now we're asking people to reduce those populations. So what's at stake here if we do that? Those recommendations were developed at a different time. Different corn varieties and hybrids are available now. So can we actually reduce the population and still get adequate yields? And, we've done some work with population. You can see ground cover over here, and this is the percentage of ground cover of cover crop after harvest at these lower seeding rates versus higher seeding rates. So clearly it would make a difference if we could reduce the population, but are the farmers going to lose too much? And that's what we're looking at now. The other piece that we've been working on for years, this is not new, is trying to get farmers to grow shorter season corn. And growing shorter season corn would allow the corn to be either planted a little bit later or harvested a little bit earlier. So again, that cover crop has more time to grow, either in the spring or also in the fall. And this has been a long time, kind of a lot of data collection, really trying to show farmers again that there are a lot of varieties out there now that are shorter season. And when we say shorter season in Vermont, we're talking this kind of 80, high 80 relative maturity up to, this kind of low 90s. And you can see that there are really good varieties that mature more quickly and also yield really well. So variety trial work across the Northeast is really important because it helps farmers figure out what of these short season varieties am I going to be able to grow that's going to push out a lot of yield so that I can grow a better cover crop. Back when I first started my job, a lot of farmers were growing 100-day corn and, harvesting in October, sometimes even November. And that's bad on many fronts. It just gets riskier. Not a lot of time left in the season to store manure or spread manure if you get an early frost. It's very risky. So there's a lot of benefit to trimming back the maturity of the corn if you can find the right varieties that are going to perform well, even though they're short season. And they are out there, which is really great. All right. So we've done a lot of work on that end, trying to, again, to do simple things, either to the cover crop or, selecting these short season varieties, but we haven't really dove into more major changes, like really changing the herbicide programs, changing populations, row widths, all these things. And that's what we're looking at now. So currently we have funded through NRCS. I believe maybe they provided some funding for this program as well. Funded through NRCS, a big on-farm trial where we're working with 30 farms across Vermont. And you can see all the different locations are these blue dots, and all the fields are in green and yellow. And we are comparing these modified corn practices to their current practices to see if we modify these practices to enhance the cover crops, are we going to reduce yield? Are we going to reduce quality? And this, I don't want to say this is without risk to the farmers, because modifying a weed control program can be very risky. And then, of course, you know, changing varieties that they're not familiar with, all those kinds of things are risky for farmers. And so this project has helped us take some of the risk out of that by being able to compensate them and really look at these modifications on a much larger scale. So we just interseeded these fields for a second time. We started the trial last year, and there's approximately 1,500 acres that we're doing this work on. So we're reducing the corn populations a bit, not much. We're also using the skip row technique. So you can see this is a planter right here. And this is the planter wheel. And you can see right here, there's these 4 pink filled in holes. And that creates kind of this artificial skip in the field that you can see up in this diagram. So every 17.5 feet, there's 4 plants missing in the row. And again, the goal of that was to try to create a little more light that would penetrate into the canopy as the canopy began to close and allow for that cover crop to establish better. All right, I'm just going to look quick and see. No, I'm just making sure there aren't any questions. All right. Here we go. Please feel free to put any questions you have in the chat box. I know we're going to take those afterwards, but okay. So the other thing we did was modify the herbicide program, and I would say this was the piece that the farmers were a little less, they were a little weary about it. And a little concerned because we were trying to use a low residual herbicides so that once we sprayed for weeds, we would be able to go back in and plant a cover crop, you know, within a few weeks. And, you know, that for a lot of farmers felt very risky because they were concerned that there would be a lot of weed escapes and lead to significant issues in their corn production fields. So what we found was that the weed control was very good with our trial weed control program. So in the graph here, you can see control fields and trial fields. And actually our weed control program in the trial fields tended to work better than what people were using in their everyday corn production. So that actually felt really good, and I think is allowing farmers to rethink the herbicides that they are applying. And this over here is summer surface cover. So it just looks at how much of the cover is from weeds and then how much is from cover crop. So the cover crop in the trial field had been interseeded. So there was cover crop growing and very, very few weeds. And in the control field, more weeds and obviously very little cover crop. So the modification didn't impact the weed control, and it did just, you know, from this quick peak in the summer look like we got much better cover crop establishment. So that was great. One of the interesting things, so with our interseeding, what we found was that with our mixture, which included a clover, a grass, and a radish type species, you can see in 2020, the radish by far established the best, made up the most biomass in the fall of 2020. And beside the radish, there was also decent grass growth. There was very little clover that could be sampled, and very few weeds too. So at least from a weed perspective, that was good. But you can see that the clover didn't seem to establish as well. So I think, you know, we definitely are looking at fine tuning our mixture. This is a mixture that we've used in Vermont for years. It works really well here. But we're thinking we might need to change the ratios a bit. What was interesting is that the clover was actually more present the following spring, as you might imagine. The ryegrass and the radish winter killed here in Vermont, and the clover survived as we thought it would, and was growing pretty well in some of the fields the next spring. So what about yields? So the trial fields and the control fields, you can see the control fields had a slightly higher yield. It was about a ton difference. You have to remember the control fields were all kinds of different varieties because it was whatever the farmer wanted to grow or what they were growing on their farm. The trial fields were 3 varieties that were short season and also selected for a particular leaf architecture as well. And across the board, they did yield about a ton lower. But, you know, in some cases on the farms, as you can see here, they yielded identical, and in other cases, there were big differences, but it definitely was farm dependent. And again, here's the cover crop biomass from fall. And you can see overall, we had decent biomass. I mean, some fields, more than half of the fields were over 1,000 pounds of cover crop biomass in the fall, which is a substantial amount of biomass being produced from interseeding. You know, generally, if we get 700 pounds of biomass, we're very happy in the fall months. And so overall, we were very happy with how the modified practices allowed us to establish cover crops. So I think we still have a lot of tinkering to do and a lot of exciting things that we are going to continue to look at as we move forward. I think probably one of the pieces that we need to start looking at more closely is the varieties of corn that farmers are growing, and are they well suited for cover cropping? And, you know, we haven't looked at varieties of corn for, you know, in that way. You know, again, generally it's, well, do they have a good disease resistant package? Do they fit our growing season? What do they yield like? Do they grow well on my soil type? But what we're not asking is, do they allow for good establishment of interseeded cover crops? And what about a variety allows for good interseeding of cover crops? You know, as an example, some varieties have this upright leaf growth. Some have leaves that kind of fan out, and that's going to make a big difference in light penetration. Some of them grow better at lower populations and produce the same yield, and others don't. So really understanding that is going to help us make huge leaps and strides in growing successful cover crops. So this graph here with some data over to the right was some data that we collected last year. And you can see all these different corn varieties at the bottom. And, you know, they are all around the same maturity. These are all around between 95 and 98 day corn varieties. And this black line shows the corn yield. So our, you know, thought was that a higher yielding corn variety would always lead to lower density of interseeded cover crop, because there's just so much yield there, it would just outcompete. And you can see that that clearly was not true, that our highest yielding variety, which yielded over 25 tons, actually, I think it was 27 or 28 tons of corn silage per acre, had the highest yield, but also had one of the highest cover crop biomasses. So it really went against what we were thinking. And then you can see here that the lowest yielding variety didn't have the highest cover crop biomass. So what is it about these varieties that are making cover crops more or less able to establish? And I think that is really important for us to understand as we, proceed on this quest to increase cover cropping across the landscape, and also to be able to maximize the value and benefits of that cover crop. Stephanie, I just want to do a time check before I dive in to anything else, because I can't see any clock or anything. Maybe she's not there. Or Jennifer, just want to check, make sure I'm not over time.
It's 11:15, Heather.
Okay, great. So I have some more time.
Yeah.
All right, good. Thank you. All right, so the other component or practice that we're trying to modify now, which is definitely risky to the farms, is increasing the width between the corn rows. And really, this work was inspired by the work that the practical farmers of Iowa have been doing, where they're looking at wide row, growing corn in wider rows, and between those rows, growing cover crops. And this practice is called solar corridors, or solar corridor cropping systems. And it's really starting to gain a lot of attention. And, it's an old practice, which is basically kind of pairing crops and rotating like strips of those crops to maximize solar capture. And again, we see this in fields that where they are using maybe strip cropping on highly sloped areas. That would be sort of a type of solar corridor cropping system. But again, with cover crops and cash crops, this seems to be gaining a lot of momentum, and is something that we wanted to investigate here in Vermont as well. If we widen the area between the rows of corn, could we establish better cover crops? It seems like that would make sense, where we would have a kind of a bigger area for those cover crops to grow and thrive. And so the solar corridor cropping system, and this is a formal definition, is designed to maximize sunlight by increasing infiltration between each row or pair of rows, and integrating row crops with interseeded cover crops for year-round soil cover. And so again, the thought is there would be more uniform vertical distribution of sunlight, and the increased light would contribute both to increased cover crop yield, but maybe also to increased crop yield, right? Because think about, even a 20-acre field of corn. The rows of corn right in the middle of that 20 acres don't get as much sunlight as the rows of corn on the outside of the field. So, I think many people have seen that corn that's on those outside rows, and sometimes they have like 3 ears, and they're just huge plants because they're getting more sunlight often. And so this is sort of playing off from that concept. What if we give each row of everything a little more sunlight? Will it maximize output? And so we've been investigating this to see if it would work here in Vermont in silage corn. So here's just some photos. We tried 30-inch row corn, which is the standard, which means there's 30 inches between each row. And then basically we just removed some of the rows from our planter to make 60-inch row corn. That's pretty easy to do. And most all of our farmers have 30-inch row planters, so they could do that. They could turn off row units and make 60-inch rows. And you can see to the left here up on the top, we have cover crop growing in 60-inch row corn. So you can see it's quite large, more filled in, more robust. And then to the right is cover crop growing in 30-inch row corn. So you can see the cover crop's not quite as robust for sure, maybe even a little less diverse. And so definitely there's some value to looking at this practice. And here's some other pictures you can see to the right here. We use more diverse cover crops in this trial. You can see there's sunflowers and sun hemp, cowpeas growing in this more diverse cover crop that definitely would not thrive too well in a 30-inch row system. So if we now look at light infiltration going from 30 inches to 60 inches, certainly you can see here, this is mid-July. In a 30-inch row setting, we'd already be down to 30% light hitting the bottom of the ground. That was in 2019. and 2020, by this time, we were down, or by mid-July, we were down to 10%. And this is right about the time that we're interseeding, okay? And in the 60-inch row corn, you can see that there's still 60% light available, basically for almost, 2 weeks or more. There's plenty of light, more light for that cover crop to grow than in that 30-inch row corn. Now, interestingly, you can see as we get into August, all those numbers come closer together, and that's because the cover crop is so robust at that point. There's not hardly any light hitting the ground. It's not because the corn is canopied, it's because at least in the 60-inch corn, there's a dense cover crop growing as well. So what did we find as far as cover crop yield? You can see these are different cover crops that we looked at up here. So we looked at cowpeas. We looked at the summer solar mix, which had cowpeas, sunflowers, sun hemp. And then we used our standard annual ryegrass, tillage, radish, red clover mix that we normally use in our interseeding projects. And so you can see in 2019, the cowpeas yielded the best. And of course, they're nitrogen fixers. So certainly that would be advantageous. And then you can see that other diverse mixture yielded the next highest, and then the annual ryegrass tillage radish mix. 2020 was a bit different. The cowpeas didn't do as well, and that's because we had a leaf hopper outbreak in Vermont, and the leaf hoppers annihilated the cowpeas. So I think, another area to be explored is what are some of the pest issues that might be associated with cover crops that we hadn't thought about. The other thing here was that the deer ate the cowpeas in this area of the trial as well. So it was a wildlife forage. And then, at the end of the season, basically the two yielded about the same. So the cover crops grew quite well. That's a lot of biomass. This biomass measurement was taken right before the corn was harvested, which was in the end of September. Okay, so this wasn't in November before killing frost. This was taken right before the corn was harvested. So that is a lot of biomass to be produced by a cover crop in that short amount of time. So those wide rows really worked. So if you look at the next graph over here, you can see in those 60-inch rows, we're producing another ton of biomass, which also means lots of roots, lots of diversity, probably, lots going on in that system that, we have yet to measure, but it definitely produced a lot of cover crop. And then you can see compared to the 30-inch row. So this is great, right? So let's look at the yields. And in 2019, we didn't see a huge yield reduction from the 30-inch to the 60-inch. And I say huge, it was 3 tons difference. And for some farmers, that would definitely be a deal breaker. But most farmers looked at that 3 tons and they thought, okay, can we overcome that? Right? What can we do to tweak this system so that we can overcome that yield decline? But in 2020, we saw a a really different story where we saw 6 tons of yield drag, and that would be difficult, I think, for most farmers to deal with. That's quite significant, and disappointing, especially coming off of that first year. And we can talk a little bit about what we think we can do here. You can see the cover crops themselves didn't they didn't impact the corn yields differently. The cowpeas didn't increase corn yields, and nothing really decreased the corn yields either. So that's good. It didn't seem like selecting one or the other made a huge difference as far as how it impacted the corn yields themselves. So what about soil health? We did do a Cornell, a cash test at the end of the season. And so we didn't wait a year or anything like that. Just basically after we harvested, we went out and took a Cornell soil health test. And you could see we didn't pick up much significant difference at all between the cover crops for these metrics. We did see that in this mix, this has the tillage radish in it. You can see that did seem to break up the soil more than the other cover crop mixes, but that was the only difference that we saw overall. And when we compared the 30 to the 60-inch rows, we still didn't see a whole lot of difference in the soil health at that point, but we did see a difference in the kind of hardness of the soil overall. So it did improve more with the 60-inch rows. So what are we going to do from here? Because, that 6-ton yield decline is pretty harsh, but farmers are really interested in these systems. The big challenge, I think, not only is the yield decline, but when you harvest corn for silage, like I mentioned, you go out and you chop the whole plant. And these cover crops were as tall as the corn, some of them. And so when we went out and chopped the corn, we also chopped the cover crop into the corn. It didn't impact the quality of the corn silage, or didn't seem to. You can see it didn't seem to impact the yields overall that much. But what it did do was it killed the cover crop because these are annual crops, the sunflowers, the cowpeas, all of that. So it removed all that organic matter, and then the cover crop died. And so when November rolled around, you could hardly tell that there was an actual cover crop there. And that wasn't really the point, right? The point was that we would grow this great, robust cover crop, very diverse. It would add those diverse functions and benefits to the soil. Then it would be there, still growing after we took the cash crop. And in our case, it would have been killed over the winter months, but a lot of the biomass and residue would be left there and incorporated back into the soil. And that was not what happened. So we need to think about what species we should be planting in silage corn, okay? And then thinking about how to overcome that yield depression. And some of that, I think, has to do with the variety selection. you know, what variety are we going to select that is going to be better able to grow at high densities in wider rows. And then the other piece that we're looking at now is based off from John Graber's work in Wisconsin, where he's establishing forage crops into corn. And we think if we can establish a forage crop into the corn for the farmer to have the next season, that losing a couple of tons of corn silage yield, not 6, but a couple, would be palatable, because what they would have the next season is an already established hay crop. So these are the kinds of projects that we're working on now. We just received some funding from NRCS to look at this. The other piece that we're evaluating is different width rows. So what about 36 or 40-inch rows instead of 60? You know, can we widen the row a bit to enhance cover crops and still, you know, not see that huge yield depression? So that's where we're at this point. All right. Any, just gonna check my time again. Oh, it's 12:15. Oh, right, Eastern time. All right. Any, I guess I can take a minute for questions if anybody has questions. Otherwise, I'm going to switch gears a little bit if we have time and talk about stacking practices. Do we have time, or are we done now? Which is fine too.
Heather, yeah, we are. I think you got started a little bit late, but
yeah, we can end.
Yeah, okay.
It's a good stopping point.
Okay, very good.
All right. And thank you.